covert and overt. Key part of the plan was to form new organizations to continue the work. This is how Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, head of Project Ahmad, put it. Remember that name, Fakhrizadeh. The general aim is to announce the closure of Project Ahmad, but then he adds, special activities, you know what that is, special activities will be carried out under the title of scientific know-how developments.
Hi everyone, I'm Dana Lewis and welcome to another edition of Backstory. That was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in 2018, talking about the Iranian senior nuclear scientist who on November the 27th was assassinated by a remotely operated series of weapons in Iran. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was a brigadier general in the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, an academic physicist, and he headed up the nuclear program of Iran. Netanyahu has always been a proponent of military action against Iran and likely ordered the killing. It's ironic that just a few days before the hit on Fakhrizadeh, Haaretz newspaper in Israel ran an analysis piece saying, Netanyahu warns Biden as if his Iran strategy hadn't failed miserably with Obama and Trump. In terms of actually influencing the nuclear deal, it said, the Prime Minister never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. The essence of that article was in warning incoming U.S. President Biden not to go back on the 2015 nuclear agreement. Mr. Iran, as Netanyahu was often dubbed in Israel, could have taken an active role in the original nuclear talks with Tehran and made the deal to stop Iran from developing a nuclear bomb airtight. But Netanyahu preferred to sulk on the sidelines and then heavily criticize the agreement, poisoning his relations with the Obama presidency. And now probably he's doing the same with the Biden administration. On this backstory, analysis from the Soufan Centre think tank on what Iran may do now. But first, a rare opportunity to hear from a man who was on the European team negotiating the Iranian nuclear deal. He was a former national security advisor here in Britain, incredibly well briefed, with first-hand knowledge on Iran and its attempts to arm itself with nuclear weapons. All right, in London, where I am now, I want to introduce you to Sir Mark Lyall Grant, who previously worked for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office as High Commissioner in Pakistan, and he served the UK's ambassador to the UN for 6 years. And he was National Security Advisor to two Prime Ministers, David Cameron and Theresa May, until 2017. Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Donna. Pleasure to be here.
Mr. Ambassador, can I say, you were in Iran. You went there as part of the negotiations. How many times?
Well, just once. I was the UK Iranian nuclear negotiator for basically a 2.5-year period when I was the political director in the Foreign Office in London. And together with the France and Germany, the United States, China and Russia, we negotiated unsuccessfully whilst I was there, but eventually leading to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was agreed in 2015. And as part of that process, we went to Tehran in 2008 to present an agreed plan by the foreign ministers of those 6 countries. And then we met Iran twice more in Geneva as follow-up meetings to that first one. So we had just the one visit to Tehran.
And what was that like? What was the atmosphere like in Tehran?
Well, Tehran is, I hadn't been there before. It's a very interesting city. You've got the mountains in the background. I wouldn't say it's a beautiful city, but the setting is very pleasant. And there's a lot of people who, if you meet them privately, can speak perfectly openly. One of the paradoxes about Iran, and particularly the rupture between Iran and the United States since 1979, is that Iran has a population that is more pro-Western than any of the Arab nations in the region. It has greater internet penetration than any of the neighbors, certainly in the Arab countries. And therefore, it is quite a sophisticated population. And when you meet in private, as I met with various NGOs and think tankers after the official talks, you can have some very interesting discussions.
Let's fast forward to where we are now. I mean, a lot has happened, right? So now you have people who are calling in Europe, diplomats that are saying France, Germany, the UK must move quickly to set out a roadmap for Iran so that the incoming Biden administration will get the US to come back to the table, get Iran to come back to the table, especially now given the escalating tensions. Do you think that's happening in the background, and it's got to happen?
Yeah, I'm sure it is happening, and it should happen, because there is an opportunity with Joe Biden coming in January to see whether there is a possibility of re-engaging Iran on this nuclear deal. Because personally, and I think I'm speaking certainly for the three European governments, it was a mistake for President Trump to pull out of the deal completely in 2018. The deal is perfect. Let's be 100% clear about that. And we can talk about that, the weaknesses in the deal, but it was certainly a lot better than the potential alternatives at the time. It was therefore a mistake to just pull out of the deal rather than see whether it would be improved in some way. So I think Joe Biden...
If I can jump in there, I mean, John Bolton, the former national security advisor of Trump, and a lot of different Republicans have poured so much water on this deal, saying that it's unverifiable. It's Trump himself is saying it's the worst deal ever. Why do they say that? If you say essentially...
Yeah, let me address some of those criticisms, because essentially there are three criticisms that you can make, legitimate criticisms you can make of the deal that was struck. The first is that it covered only the nuclear weapons program. It did not cover the ballistic missile technology program, which of course is important too. Secondly, it did not cover Iran's malign regional role. It supports the terrorist organizations, for the Houthis, for Hezbollah, etc. in the region, and its attempts to destabilize some of its neighbors. And thirdly, the deal was time limited. There was a sort of sunset clause in the deal, so it would last only a maximum of 15 years. Now, those are all legitimate criticisms, but you have to put that against the alternatives and history, because if I just could delve into the history a little bit, there was a time when I was in the negotiating where the intelligence was clear that Iran had the capability to acquire a nuclear weapon, a nuclear bomb, within less than 1 year period. Now, this deal did prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons for at least 15 years, because it had some very important characteristics in it. It had in it the need to eliminate entirely the stockpile of medium enriched uranium. It had to get rid of or reduce the stockpile of low enriched uranium, 98% of that. And it only allowed very limited amounts of low enriched uranium for the next 15 years. It also reduced the number of centrifuges by 2/3. And most importantly, and this goes against some of the commentary that you've mentioned, it was entirely verifiable. There was a whole regime of inspections by the
UN.
By the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a part of, affiliated to the UN, if you like, where they could go with inspections whenever they wanted in all the facilities that were covered. So it was, I think, a good deal. And what it meant was two things. One, that it prevented Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon for those 15 years. And 15 years is a long time in politics. So in that 15 years, you could have regime change in Tehran, you could have new abilities to attack the program, perhaps offensive cyber weapons, etc., that could be used against the program. So buying 15 years, when it looked as though they would have that capability within 1 year, was very important. And it avoided this famous, used to call the fork in the road, that as you approach the period where you had a fork, where you had to decide either you were going to bomb Iran and try and take out militarily all its nuclear facilities, incidentally would not be easy because they are deep underground, many of them, or the other fork is that you accept, like we have for India and Pakistan, say, that they have acquired nuclear weapons despite the non-proliferation treaty, and you contain them in some other political diplomatic way. That is the fork in the road that the JCPOA avoided or pushed back at least for 15 years. What we're faced with now, having President Trump having pulled out of the deal and essentially the deal falling apart, although the Europeans have never sort of formally advocated it, and nor in fact is Iran completely, but it has started breaching the deal, is that you're going to just bring that fork in the road closer. So there is an opportunity now to try and reverse that bad decision that I think President Trump made.
Why did he do it? I mean, you say, people like Bolton and Trump say it wasn't verifiable. But I mean, clearly, it's just not your opinion. But I mean, the UN, the IAEA clearly has shown us pictures and live camera feeds, and they said it was absolutely verifiable, and that's why the Europeans were willing to stick with the deal. Why did the Americans want to pull out of it? Just for political headline, or how is it understandable?
I think there's a lot of politics in it. I mean, you're right to quote the fact that President Trump had said it was the worst deal ever, and he'd said that before he was elected. I mean, this was during his sort of campaign rhetoric. And fundamentally, it was an Obama deal. The deal was done by President Obama, and everything that President Obama did, President Trump didn't like, whether it was Obamacare internally or a lot of the foreign policy issues. So given that Obama considered the nuclear deal to be a sort of shining example of his achievements in foreign policy, and to be honest, he didn't have a huge number to point to, but this was perhaps one.
No, and you're not the first one to say that. Yeah,
it was an opportunity to attack it. And I think it was probably more that than anything else.
Right, but then you fold in Israel.
John Bolton probably played a role in it, because don't forget that President Trump had 2 years in office before he pulled out of the deal, and it's not complete coincidence that he did so shortly after John Bolton was appointed as national security.
Right. Bolton was never a favor of dealing with Iran, negotiating with Iran, and was always a proponent of military action against Iran without really ever laying out how that would be successful. Otherwise, Israel probably would have done it on its own. But you roll in Israel, too, though. I mean, there is another interloper and a state which didn't think it's a real deal and didn't think that it was verifiable and thought all along that Iran was slowly making the bomb anyway.
Yes, he made that case publicly at the United Nations, I recall, with a big sort of cartoon picture of a bomb and how threatening that was. And I attended talks between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Theresa May in Downing Street when we argued back and forth about the merits of the nuclear deal. I think, and I personally argued the case with Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon and Trump's team when they came into office. So, we knew the arguments that the Israelis were going to make, and we knew the arguments that President Trump's team were going to make, but we simply didn't agree with them. And I think they had perhaps a lack of understanding, not the Israelis, but the Trump team had a slight lack of understanding of the history that had gone into this and the sort of 15 years of negotiations that had led up to the deal. I think Netanyahu's point of view, of course, he wanted Trump to abrogate the deal because he wanted a free hand to try and actually force the fork in the road. I think Israel felt that if fork came, he could persuade the Americans to do the bombing. I mean, Israel could do some itself, but it couldn't wipe out Iran's nuclear facilities on its own.
Now you have Israel that has carried out this allegedly this assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, and of course Netanyahu hasn't commented, and I think the head of his intelligence services has said they don't know who carried out the deal, but certainly Iran thinks it was Israel, and maybe some of the Iranian opposition that is based in Europe, they've accused them as well. Does it achieve anything? Does it roll back a nuclear program by killing the head scientist? And who do you think did it?
I don't know who did it, but I don't think it's unreasonable to conclude that it was probably the Israelis. And I don't think it's unreasonable to conclude that the timing is linked to the fact that President Trump has 2 more months in office. But I think, whereas you could argue, and I think I probably would argue, that the killing of General Soleimani in January this year by the American, right, did have quite a substantive impact on the ability of the Quds Force to carry out terrorist operations overseas. But Khomeini was ahead, and he was a very powerful figure. I'm not so sure about Fakhrizadeh. I mean, he's certainly an important scientist, but there are other scientists, and Iran already has the nuclear know-how. It's not as though it needs research. It's more about development of the program rather than actually initiating the research necessary to get the technology right of the research. So I'm less convinced, although I don't know Fakhrizadeh's background and his precise role. I don't think it will have a particularly substantial impact on the program itself. And I think there is a risk that it could be counterproductive impact for two reasons. One, it will reinforce Iranian incentive and determination to press ahead with the program. And also, let's not forget that there are presidential elections in Iran coming in 2021. And President Rouhani may not look like a sort of moderate Democrat, and certainly isn't a moderate Democrat, but as we know from Ahmadinejad and others who have preceded him, there are people who are much more radical and much more hardline than him, who will leap on these sorts of attacks, and it will certainly improve their chances of election.
If whoever carried out this attack was interested in tearing up the pavement for a Biden administration to re-engage with Iran and hoping that Iran will fiercely respond and make the gap between dialogue with the new American administration even larger, do you think that Iran will disappoint them? Are they smart enough to hold back and wait for that moment where they can move to dialogue rather than move to some kind of response, wherever it be?
I think it's difficult to judge that because one can't think about Iran as a monolithic political entity. You can say in Saudi Arabia that all the decisions are taken by one, maybe two people. You can't say that in Iran. It's not a democracy, but there is a plurality of politics in Iran that is completely absent from the Arab states, for instance. So there is a president, he has a role, Rani, but there is the supreme leader, there's the IRGC, there's the Bazaris, there's the Majlis Shura. Now, all of these bodies have an influence in the eventual decision that might be taken in the area. So I think if you look at President Rouhani and the Foreign Minister Zarif, they will certainly want to not close off the possibility of engagement with Joe Biden. But equally, the Israelis probably, absolutely, for the reasons you say, have an interest in making it much more difficult for that re-engagement to take place. And President Trump, in his last couple of months, may help to facilitate that. So I think there is a risk that Iran will be pushed into a retaliation which would make engagement more difficult, certainly.
Last question to you. You said you got to that fork in the road where, you either had to choose them getting a bomb or you had to choose dialogue. And then the drawbacks in the deal were the fact that you didn't take it didn't put a noose around their rocket program, or it didn't bridle malign activities. I mean, it's almost naive to think that a new agreement, even with the best intentions, is suddenly going to deal with all of that. I mean, it's almost, a lot of people would say you have to start somewhere, go back into a nuclear non-proliferation agreement with Iran, and then while you have whatever the period is going to be this time, whether it's going to be another 15 years or up to that 15 years, then you start dealing with some of these other issues? Or do you think it should be a more encompassing, in retrospect, a more encompassing deal?
Well, I think you can try and make it a more encompassing deal. I mean, let's not forget that the original deal, yes, it was restricted to the nuclear program, but that didn't prevent other action taking place at the same time on the ballistic missiles and particularly on the regional role. It didn't rule out anything either then or indeed on the nuclear program at the end of the 15-year period. John Bolton is a good example of someone who says often, look, let's make the problem bigger. So we make the problem bigger, we bring in these other two issues, and then let's sit around and negotiate. And I think there may well be an effort to try and do that. But whether it will be successful or not, we'll see. It wasn't successful in the sort of 15-year negotiations in which I was involved, but there is no doubt that what is constraining the Iranians is the sanctions. They do have economic sanctions. The UN Security Council is united against the nuclear program, so the opportunity for even tougher sanctions. So they are suffering, and that may make them more amenable to some of these wider discussions.
Ambassador Mark Lyall Grant, great to have your perspective, somebody who's been in the room and were part of the negotiations as a former national security advisor to two prime ministers here in Britain. Great to talk to you, sir. Thank you.
Pleasure.
All right, let's go to Pittsburgh now. And Colin Clarke is a senior research fellow with the Soufan Centre. Hi, Colin.
How you doing, Dana?
Timing. Talk to me about the assassination of the senior nuclear scientist. Why now, and who do you think did it?
Well, I think there's considerable concern, at least by the Israelis, that a Biden administration is not going to be as open-minded to Israel's kind of point of view as the Trump administration was, and I think that's probably correct. There are concerns that the Biden administration will re-engage with the Iranians and attempt to re-enter the multilateral nuclear deal. And that's something that the Israelis are very adamant against.
Why is Netanyahu so adamantly against it? And then I also talked to John Bolton, Trump's national security advisor and former ambassador to the UN before, and he said it just wasn't verifiable. I mean, they really they really put holes in the agreement. And yet you talk to other people, Europeans here, some of them I've talked to who helped negotiate this agreement, and they say it was verifiable and it was a good agreement and it stopped Iran from getting a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, well, clearly Netanyahu disagrees. I think, many hardliners within Israel are uncomfortable where there comes to an element of trust with the Iranian regime. And I think that's born over decades of mistrust. And so in some ways, I do see the perspective of Netanyahu. However, it's my belief that the only, really viable way forward is engaging with the Iranians diplomatically. And even if we are able to kind of, renegotiate a deal, I'm not one for blind trust. I'm more of a guy that believes in, trust in God, but lock your car.
Trust but verify, as the Russians, or as President Reagan said to Gorbachev, trust but verify. And in fact, in this case, they had UN inspectors in there verifying, and the IAEA seemed like they were pretty happy with the outcome. Look, do you believe, and I've just read your report that you wrote for the Soufan Centre, do you believe that the Saudis were approached in this meeting by Netanyahu to lay the groundwork for a military strike against Iran by the Trump administration?
I don't know. I hope not. I do believe it's feasible that the Saudis were approached. But, if you are the Saudis or the Emiratis or another country in the region, and you think that, you've got leverage or you've got some chips to play, I don't know why you'd cash them in now with the Trump administration. You're more likely to wait and engage with the Biden administration, because otherwise you're dealing with a lame duck. I know that Trump's approach has been one of scorched earth. He's trying to break everything on his way out, which is really, in my opinion, that's detrimental to U.S. policy. It's really a policy of vengeance. So it's going to be something we're going to have to spend a lot of time repairing. So is it feasible that the Saudis were approached about this? Probably. But I don't think it's wise to begin a conflict full stop, much less, with less than 70 days left in the administration and really no mandate, right? I mean, this is someone that's spending most of his time trying to discredit free and fair elections in his own country.
Well, he's always worried about his record and wiping out President Obama's record. And this deal, by the way, was part of the Obama administration's deal that he wanted to get rid of in the campaign. But you mentioned the word vengeance. Talk to me about Iranian vengeance. I mean, what are they capable of doing? And do you think that they'll pull the trigger on retaliation at this point?
Could be. If you go back to September 2019, you see exactly what the Iranians are capable of doing, operating through proxies in the region, including the Houthi rebels, operating from Iraqi soil, in areas kind of nominally controlled by Iraqi Shia militia. If you look at, again, going back to the Houthis, their capabilities, you're talking about a violent non-state actor with the capabilities of a nation state. I mean, really fairly sophisticated, ability to use drones, ability to use some pretty high-speed weaponry, including missiles.
And go after who?
And attack the Saudis, attack Saudi infrastructure primarily. And I think, when you go back to September 2019, I think I was on Bloomberg television a couple of days after the attack, and the interviewer said, well, so what's the United States going to do? And I said, what do you mean? We weren't attacked. Saudis were. And he was kind of taken aback that, I would even suggest that the Saudis should defend themselves. I made a quip, which, I think, drew a lot of flack from it. But I said, we sell them the weapons. Do we have to pull the trigger for them as well? I'm certainly not concerned
about the Iranian missile assault on oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. But then there's been many other. What else could Iran do? I mean, what are the targets in terms of Israeli targets, American targets abroad? What do they have? What are they capable of?
They're capable of a lot. Look, through Lebanese Hezbollah, they have global reach. We've seen Hezbollah strike, all over the world, in Latin America and elsewhere. There's been plots that have been disrupted in Georgia and India and Thailand. We've seen the bus bombing in Bulgaria. So I have no doubt that the Iranians are capable of responding. The question becomes, how wise is it? The Israelis are more than capable of taking care of themselves. And I just don't think getting into a kind of tit for tat conflict with Israel right now, the Israelis have shown what they're capable of doing. And they don't really feel compelled to hold back. So it would be unwise on the part of Iran to respond in full force. But what I will say is Iran is kind of the master of walking right up to the line without crossing it. These kind of nibbling attacks, around the edges. And for that, they'd likely use proxies, whether, Shia militia in Iraq or Lebanese Hezbollah or another kind of Iranian proxy.
And I guess the big question for the Biden administration now is, can they easily re-enter this agreement with Iran? Because a lot of things have happened on the ground. And in fact, the program has moved, the nuclear program has moved forward. So what is the challenge for a newly elected President Biden to try to bring not Iran to heel, but to have some kind of agreement on transparency within their nuclear program and to try to get them to step back?
It's a real challenge. I mean, it's certainly no fait accompli, as some analysts have described in commentary and various hot takes that I've read, that just because there's a Biden administration means we're going to have an Iran nuclear deal. I think far from it. The region looks quite different than it did even 4 years ago. Some of the alliances have shifted. So I wouldn't say that it's a certainty that the U.S. will re-enter the deal. And I think, there's a lot that Iran still needs to do, including curbing its behavior through the proxies that we just talked about before, we should, just blindly re-enter a deal and reward the Iranians. I just don't think it's smart.
Do you really think that the discussion should be that broad? That not only do you talk about their nuclear program, but you start talking about malign activities, you start talking about their missile programs. A lot of people think that just becomes unwieldy and impossible in a discussion to come to an agreement, that you need to start somewhere and you at least start building blocks on that agreement and the sanctions around it on their nuclear program.
I do think it's worth discussing because, one, you need to raise the issue that it's unacceptable. Now, what your expectations are in terms of what you're going to get out of that is totally different. But yeah, I do think it needs to be broached. And I think, it all depends on how you view your own leverage, right? With economic sanctions. That's one of the problems I've had with the Trump administration over the last 4 years. I've never really gotten a sense of how effective the Trump administration itself believes this maximum pressure campaign has been, because it's been, and I've written about this with my colleague Aryan Tabatabai, we've called it a tautology of sorts, because no matter what Iran seems to do, the administration trumpets the success of the maximum pressure campaign, but then also paints Iran as this actor that can't be stopped and that's dominating the Middle East. Well, if that's the case, then maximum pressure hasn't worked, right? If Iran acts out and increases attacks, the administration has said, look, maximum pressure is working. And if the attacks decrease, they say, look, maximum pressure is working. So, I don't know what the administration really believes. I don't know if they do.
Well, it's up to the next administration now. It looks like that this contemplation of any kind of military action in Iran, that shadow seems to have passed, although I wouldn't put anything past a desperate President Trump right now. But we'll see what President Biden does in the future then, and whether they can bring them back into some kind of a negotiated settlement.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, lastly, I think it speaks to the incoherence of Trump's strategy in the Middle East. If the goal, as he stated before, is to end endless wars, he's going to start one right before he leaves office. I think we haven't had a coherent approach to the region. It's been one of transactionalism, and so I'm looking forward to a more cogent, pragmatic relationship or strategy formulation with a Biden administration, with someone like a Jake Sullivan that knows the region well, that knows the players, that actually works across the aisle and consults with, so-called hardliners within the United States. And so I'm hopeful that we're able to make progress on that front.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.
And that's our backstory on Iran and the bomb. In case you didn't know, as we speak, there is a trial underway in Belgium of an Iranian diplomat and several others believed to be from Iran's intelligence network for smuggling explosives into Europe and then plotting to carry out a bombing of an Iranian opposition group in France. The bomb was handed over at a Pizza Hut in Luxembourg. The intent, prosecutors say, was to blow up a rally in France of a prominent opposition group to the Iranian government. Hundreds would have been killed. The Iranian diplomat Asadollah Assadi allegedly carried the bomb, a little more than a pound of TATP explosives, and a detonator to Vienna from Iran in his luggage on an Austrian Airlines flight. He then drove it to Luxembourg in a rented car and handed it over to an Iranian-Belgium couple on June 30th, 2018. And it was the Israeli Mossad who tipped off French and Belgian authorities. Iran has denied the plot and said the charges were designed to embarrass Tehran just before President Hassan Rouhani traveled to Europe to rally support for the 2015 nuclear deal. Thanks for listening to Backstory. Share this link. Subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen. We're on most major platforms like Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Pandora, Deezer, and many more. If you would like to sponsor this podcast, let us know. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.